Hello everybody, recording live poolside from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 57 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, wherever it is, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, it's going to be pretty good. We're going to talk about exercise dosing. How much of the good stuff can you give someone so you get them to reach their goals? We're going to talk about CrossFit shoulder injuries. Why do so many CrossFitters injure their shoulders? This is not my bias. This is someone who does CrossFit telling me this. Stay tuned. And last but not least, we're going to talk about regional interdependence education. How do you get people to buy into you working on an area that's not where they hurt, or working on a skill that's not going to help them do a move they want to do? Answers will be had tonight. And these are questions asked from the people, answered for the people, by this people, fam recognize fam. Before I dive in, a little bit of housekeeping. If you want to help people who are hurting multiple areas, or you want to get people squatting, deadlifting better, pushing better, pulling better, all of that stuff, and you hit a wall, and you need someone to break down that wall, you want to definitely sign up for the Human Matrix, because it is coming your way September 15th and 16th in Seattle, Washington, October 27th, 28th from Kansas City, Kansas, and November 10th and 11th, Portland, Oregon. That's where they are this year. There's going to be more next year, but you want to sign up for these first few, folks. That's all I have for housekeeping. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? First question comes from John. John asks, what factors do you look for that determine that this was the right amount of a move to use to lead to objective test changes sticking? How much stimulus before we have an adaptation? John, that's quite a lovely question you got there. Let me see what I can do. How much? So the cop-out answer, which I will first give, is it depends. And let's talk about what it depends on. But I will give you some recommendations. It depends on a lot of factors. How often is the individual who you are coaching activities through going to execute? How well are they going to do with it? How good do they pick stuff up? These are things that I'm considering when I'm going to be dosing activities for someone to do at home. That also makes me think about how much I'm going to dose someone, how many activities I'm going to give them. All of these things are relevant. How often are you seeing them? That's another thing to consider. For me, if it's in person, I generally see people twice a week. If it's online, it could be anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. So that might impact my dosing as well. Maybe you are a trainer who sees a person 5 days a week. Gosh, you're lucky. Because then you can work on the activities and see the objective changes much faster than a joker like me can. So all of those things go into the amount that I would prescribe someone. And I think that that's very individualized, because we also have to consider that you and I learn things at a different rate. It might take you no time to pick up the guitar, but it could take me a hot minute to learn how to play a given song. So there's a lot of differences that go into determining the right amount. And I don't think there is a right amount, because we're always kind of trying to do guesstimates to make the right call. All that being said, the way that I decide is the right amount from a physical therapy standpoint is I'm looking at a particular objective test, and we do an activity within the session. What I hope to see with however much I prescribe, we get an objective change within session. That's probably, for me, the biggest deciding factor, that this was enough. And I try to keep that as minimal as possible, or as little as possible, because you get better buy-in, you get better compliance if someone has to do less. If I am looking at shoulder internal rotation as an example, and I select a couple activities to try to improve that, I'm going to give them things that make the change. So if I can get full shoulder internal rotation with one move, that's all I need. And however many sets and reps I decided to get those changes, then we're good. Personally, I would say if we're talking about the breathing-based activities which help restore movement variability, I will generally recommend to most people 3 rounds, 5 breaths, twice a day. That way they're getting 30 breaths a day, and I usually don't change up activities for a week. If they can get a change with that amount within session, I at least know that if they keep up with that, they should be able to maintain that by the time I see them in a week. That way it also gives them enough time to learn whatever concept it is that I'm trying to teach them. Because they might need components from that particular activity to take to something a little bit more high level. So I want to make sure they have it down pat. That would be how I dose things and how often I change things and what considerations I take when someone's performing some of the stuff that I'm doing. And the week is just what works for me. That might be different for some of your clients. Maybe you're a trainer and you only see someone twice a week and they're not going to do anything on their off days. You might want to wait a lot longer. Maybe you're changing their moves once a month because you're getting a similar amount or a volume of a given stimulus. So to summarize that question, John, it depends. It depends on the individual you have in front of you. Are they a fast learner? Do they move well? Do they pick things up quickly? Are they compliant? Do they perform the stuff well at home? Those things matter in proper dosage. For me personally, I try to get someone to do, if we're talking breathing-based stuff, 3 rounds, 5 breaths twice a day, and I wait a week before I change things up because we are building concepts upon concepts and we're increasing complexity with each passing week. Those would be the things that I would consider when you are looking for an adaptation. And the most important thing, when you know that you pick the right move and the right dose, for me, you get a change within session. You get a change within session, that wows the client, increases compliance, and you're going to be in business. So, John, good question. And thank you for tuning in on that Instagram, baby. Next question, or quest, it comes from Pookie Jane. Pookie Jane asks, why do CrossFitters always hurt their shoulder? Is it a lack of stability? Is it poor movement quality? Or something else? Kelsey, aka Pookie Jane. I only know her as Pookie Jane personally. But that's an unbelievable question, and I'm going to answer it for you. There are a lot of factors that go into why someone may or may not sustain an injury. But the one thing across all factors, and probably the most important in my humble opinion, is load. In the case of CrossFit, the amount of activity done over a duration, the weights, all of these things multiplied together lead to a load on a particular tissue, such as shoulders, for example. If I do too much, or if I have too much overall load beyond what my conditioning allows, tissues are more likely to get injured. That is the premise of the acute to chronic workload, which if you want the calculator, I'll link it in my show notes. But when someone has a spike in their total workload, which sometimes if you have a beginner who hasn't done much activity and you throw them into maybe one of the more challenging WODs, they're at risk because their tissues are not prepared to tolerate that activity. So they may sustain an injury. Think about, in CrossFit in particular, how many different activities are being performed with heavy loads overhead. You have high rep snatches, you have high rep cleans, you have overhead pressing, you have push jerks, you have squat thrusters. That's a lot of overhead load. That doesn't mean that someone who is adequately prepared to tolerate those amounts can't do it. But if you're saying, Kelsey, that a lot of your people get injured, or a lot of people you know hurt their shoulders, it may be that they did a little bit more than beyond their means. So that would be something to consider, first off and foremost, is intelligent load management when you're talking about CrossFitters doing a lot of overhead-based activity. Again, if you want to learn more about that, I would highly look up Tim Gabbitt's work. He does some good stuff. He is the guy who has pioneered the acute to chronic workload. It is not perfect, but it at least gives you some objectivity in terms of determining how much load you are putting on your body, and is it more than what you've done in, say, the past month. And if you want to implement that in your training, download my acute to chronic workload calculator. I'll put a link in the show notes. Now, other things to consider would be the other factors that can potentially dampen the problematic load spike. And I got this concept from Eric Otter, but if you can think of workload spiking being the on switch on a light, think about moderators, and I'll go into what that is, as a dimmer. So maybe I get a load spike, the light flicks on, but I have protective factor A, B, and C, and that doesn't make the switch go up all the way, and it dims it down somewhat. That would be a load moderator. Things that could be load moderators. Are you sleeping well? Are you eating well? Do you have requisite movement variability to perform some of the wild and crazy things you're going to do in CrossFit? If I have those things, HRV, that could be another thing. If I have these things in a positive manner, I'm sleeping well, I'm eating good, I have good movement variability, yada, 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 then maybe when I have that load spike, I'm less at risk to sustaining some type of injury. These are things we want to push with our people. And it's one thing that actually CrossFit does pretty well. I mean, they advocate the paleo diet, they treasure a lot of these things, so it's a good community to throwing in some of those moderators. If we're talking shoulder specific, CrossFit games, but those were on maybe last week or something, or maybe they're still going, I don't know. The gym I train at had it on TV, and it was cool because I was watching these people move, and just unbelievable athletes, and unbelievable they can do so many varied things. One thing you notice though is when they're doing a lot of overhead stuff, it is just like, it is crazy the amount of shoulder flexion they can get into. I would bet that most of those successful CrossFitters in the games probably have some laxity in the shoulders to be able to achieve flexions, and maybe not into full upward rotation, because they probably have to lock down a little bit just to give themselves some stability overhead. So one way you can test this is by checking shoulder flexion. Is it full? Interesting. Do they have limitations, maybe some of the other planes, internal, external rotation? If they have that, chances are they may have some laxity present. Another thing you can do to see if this is the case is if they got full shoulder flexion, and this is something I got from Daddy O Pops Bill Hartman, so kudos to him for that. He's getting linked in the show notes for crying out sakes. But if you stick your thumb in the armpit, in some people, you'll actually feel the humerus pop forward. And a lot of times that happens shy of full shoulder flexion. If you see that, then they probably developed a little bit of laxity within the shoulder joint that may be contributing to why they're doing wild and crazy things. But also, if I have laxity, I may not be able to generate enough concentric tension to keep the shoulder safe when I'm overhead. What can you do about that, though? Well, I'm glad you asked. Things I would work on. Any activity that involves scapular upward rotation is money. That encourages you get a sound and non-lax full flexion. Things like landmine presses. I'll link a couple activities in the show notes that I've been playing with lately, but that is incredibly important for individuals who have to do a lot of overhead motion, such as CrossFitters. Another thing that I would consider, there's a muscle called the subscapularis. That is one of your rotator cuff muscles, and it runs right across the front of the shoulder. A lot of times if you do activities that kick that bad boy in, that can help reinforce some local stability within the shoulder so an individual does not pop out the front when they go overhead. I can attach some of my favorites in the show notes, but it's not what you think I would program. Like, I'm not doing a bunch of resisted shoulder IR to get that. I don't play that game. What I do play is maybe utilizing side planks and having someone reach and pronate their forearm to get a little bit of that subscap. I might be doing tricep or lat pull downs with tricep extension, almost like a D1 extension to get the subscap. Those are the kind of things that I'm utilizing to put people in that position to reinforce some of the shoulder stability that maybe they lost in order to get overhead. Those are things that I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of someone maybe who's a CrossFitter who's doing a lot of overhead work. Other than that, those would be, I would say, the big things to consider if you have someone who has shoulder pain. And I'm giving that as a blanket recommendation. Really, what needs to be done with these individuals is a proper assessment from a qualified practitioner, and that doesn't have to be a PT or a chiro or someone else like that. If you're not in pain and you got a good trainer who knows some of the stuff that I know, have them look at you. They might be able to put you down the right path to making sure that you have these moderators in place. To summarize, load is the big equalizer. You want to make sure you do not go too far above what your conditioning allots. Once you have that in place, you can throw load moderators into the mix to make sure that when you do hit a load spike, you are at less of a risk for an injury. That would entail sleep, nutrition, stress management, movement variability, among other things. From a movement variability standpoint, when we're talking about CrossFitters going overhead, you need to make sure they can upwardly rotate. You need to make sure they do so with integrity when they go into flexion. If someone's popping out the front, get them a subscapularis, and they ought to be in business. Pookie Jane. Great question. Last. Lucy asks, how do you get buy-in when someone has an area that hurts and you are not directly treating that area, or if you are not working with someone in pain and that individual is limited in a given movement and you're working on something that's not related to that movement? How do you get buy-in with these things? Well, Lucy, I'm glad you asked. And Maddie, I'm sorry if you guys can't see me on Facebook. You may want to try on Instagram. But Lucy, phenomenal question. Let's try to answer this. Buy-in is tough sometimes. If you do not have your target market as your predominant person that you see. Like me, for example, because I'm a traveler, aka a mercenary physical therapist, I don't always get to select who I want to work with for my clientele. It's basically whoever's going to come and see me. So buy-in is that much more important for these people. How I get buy-in is I will either utilize analogies or I will go into this huge spiel as to why maybe doing something that's not related to the task at hand is important for their recovery or getting them to be able to perform a particular activity without pain. A lot of times my spiel will involve something along the lines of this. And I'm just going to pretend that you guys are someone who I'm working with. After I've listened to their story and their side of things, I'm taking notes before I even go into my little spiel of what activities they're having trouble with. Because while someone might be seeing me personally for pain, what they're really seeing me for is not pain, but they have things that they want to accomplish that they can't because they hurt. I'm going to make sure that with whatever I say, I'm bringing it back to that, because that's ultimately what we're trying to get. That gets me and the client on the same page. Once I know what that is, I will say something like this. Thank you so much for answering my questions. Better helps me, better help you. Here's what we're going to do. we're going to take a look at just about everything on you. And the reason why we're going to do that is because your body moves as one cohesive unit, one piece. Let me get out of that mode for a minute. One cohesive unit, one piece. People kind of get that. People get that if they're doing one thing, that they oftentimes might compensate in some way, shape, or form. So I think a lot of people don't buy that, or will buy that. If they don't, maybe you'll say, I think that there's a reason why you hurt this area, or maybe why you can't squat. And it's up to us to kind of problem solve as to why that is, because maybe that is just the result, not necessarily the cause. So we're going to take a look at just about everything on you. You are one piece, your whole body is connected, and a lot of times when you're in pain, or maybe you're not moving effectively, and as a measure of, or as a way for your body to deal with all of this, the forces of gravity, the forces within your body, there may be certain strategies that you utilize that may increase efficiency, but at the expense of getting you to move effectively. If I reduce my ability to move as a person, what that can do is that can potentially, and it's key that I'm saying potentially, because I don't want to put any maladaptive beliefs into someone's mind by saying these things. But that could potentially put more stress and strain in particular areas if I'm working with someone in pain, or if I'm not, that could particularly limit your ability to do activity X. For example, maybe they can't squat and they don't have ankle dorsiflexion. That might be an example. And you can show them that. When I squat, my knees need to go into this position. But if I can't do this motion at the ankle, so movement options reduced, that can put stress or strain, or that can limit your ability to perform particular movements. What our job is, because this is a collaborative effort, is to see if we can give you a different strategy. If we can restore all of your movement options, what that might do is, if you're in pain, even out the workload distribution throughout your body more effectively, and that could potentially take away some of the stress and pain that you may be feeling in given areas. Or if you're not working with someone in pain, that can even out the workload distribution a bit more effectively, so you can feel more muscles work in a squat, or you can get to a better depth in a squat, or you can perform a push-out without looking silly. Don't say that, but you know what I mean. Once I've done that, and most people kind of understand where I'm coming from by that point, I ask if they have any questions and does that make sense. That way we are on the same page and we get a thorough understanding in terms of that I'm still trying to meet their goals. And what I may say after I've gone into that little spiel is, if we even out the workload distribution more effectively, that might help you with activity A, B, and C. A lot of times I see a lot of head nods when I do that. As long as you can provide some rationale as to why you're doing things, and it doesn't have to be the little explanation that I gave, and you make sure that you're continuing to relate to that person in terms of what their needs are, a lot of times they're going to do whatever it takes to get better. Sometimes you might be working with a client where maybe you don't get that buy-in right away, and maybe you give them a little bit of what they want, and you try to sprinkle a little bit of what they really need in. Sometimes, like, when you do that, that's okay. You can still, it's not like you have to get the buy-in right away. If you're giving them a little bit of what they want and it's saying, hey, maybe we can reinforce it with this, that can be another way to potentially get you closer to what you're trying to get from a buy-in standpoint with these people. So those would be the big things. And a lot of times too, as long as you look at the area in question, if we're talking about pain, you can use that as another way to support working on that person as a whole. For example, if, let's say I'm seeing someone for wrist pain, I can get them to buy into working on some other things by looking at the wrist. And maybe they have full range of motion. And I can say, hey, your wrist moves pretty good. I don't think we have to do anything here. I think the problem might be at your elbow and your shoulder, as an example. Another example could be, if they have limitations there, I can go into some of the mechanics of, well, did you know that as you move your forearm, this lower portion that connects to your wrist bends and twists, or twists and untwists, and if you can't get through that full twist and untwist, that can limit wrist motion. So we have to address things up the chain, and I can just kind of work my way up piece by piece. And that will also get people to say, oh, wow, okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. That could be another way you could break down a given movement, or get buy-in when you're treating something that's not directly where it hurts. So to summarize, the big keys are to make sure that you relate to that person's story, you relate to their whys and their goals, regardless of how you explain it. What I like to do is I like to utilize saying, you're using this strategy, I want to teach you another strategy that evens out the workload distribution, allows you to move more effectively, and that can help with pain, or that can help with some of the movements you're doing as a trainer. Also, after you've done your examination, if you check the affected area and it seems like it checks out okay, you can say, hey, that area checks out okay. We might not need to work on that area as much as you think because you're limited in some of these other areas. Or, hey, this is limited, but it can be impacted by this, this, and this. Lucy, phenomenal question, and I think that's a good stopping point for us tonight. I want to thank all y'all for tuning in. If you want to learn more about me, here's where you can find me. Go to ZachCouples.com first and foremost. You can subscribe to my newsletter while you're there. You will get almost like 4.5 hours worth of talks. You'll get 50 pages of notes. You'll get that free acute to chronic workload calculator that I was talking about. And you'll also get an email from me every Friday with some weekend goodies, some stuff you can learn while you are doing your thing. Once you've done that, you can also work with me because I offer online services. I offer 3 things, in fact. Movement consultations. Maybe you are the person who I just talked about, where you can't squat the way you want to. Or maybe you're a little toy, you're not moving effectively. Maybe you've been in pain and you've tried some things and it hasn't worked, and you want to know, hey, yeah, Caleb, it is good weather. You want to know, hey, maybe if I move a little bit better, that can help me. I can be your guy with online movement consultations. I also offer mentoring. If you want to learn how to apply some of the things that I talked about today better with your people, I can be your guy. Hit me up with the mentoring. Last but not least, I offer online training. If you want to get gains and wear, tank tops like me, or maybe you're post-rehab and you want to build your movement foundation, that is my job that I will help you with. Definitely hit me up for online training. Other places you can find me. If you want to listen to me and not look at me, I can't blame you. Search the Zach Couples Show on either iTunes or Stitcher, because guess what, folks? There's 56 other debriefs that you can listen to. Definitely hit me up on that. If you want to find me on the social media devices, I'm on Facebook /ZCouples. Twitter, the handle is @ZCouples. That Instagram, baby, Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And YouTube, if you search Zach Couples, you'll get a ton of exercises that I don't really talk about anywhere else. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you have a lovely evening. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.